Thank you all for being here for our session on urbanization and the future of cities. My name is Katie O'Reilly. I'm Managing Director of Business and Program Development for the Milken Institute. And I'm joined by a very esteemed panel. I'm going to set a little bit of context for our discussion this morning, and then we're going to jump right into the conversation with some questions. So in terms of urbanization, we're by all accounts at a very unique point in time. For the first time in history, the majority of the world's population resides in urban areas, with 54% of us living in cities today. It took about 100 centuries to get to 3.5 billion urban residents, but will take only 60 years to add 3.5 billion more. So historically, we know periods of urbanization mean good things economically and socially. Edward Glaeser, who's one of the leading thinkers on urbanization in the US, calls cities our species' greatest invention. So we'll see how true that is through the course of this conversation. But we know the growth of cities can present significant challenges, particularly when the growth is so fast that it precludes sustainable city planning. So we've seen in various countries in both the developed and the developing world strains on existing infrastructure, increasing pollution, housing and livability are all serious concerns for urban dwellers and for companies doing business in cities. And despite the increased economic opportunity in cities, urban areas are actually more unequal than rural areas, with hundreds of millions of the world's urban poor living in substandard conditions, although some would say that the urban poor are better off than the rural poor, so we'll talk a little bit about that. In addition, the world's aging population puts increasing demands on cities and is changing what it means to be a sustainable city. That's an area the Institute has done quite a bit of work on. Enlightened city planners are considering all of these factors in addition to industry diversification, attracting the right human capital. So not only those who are educated and prepared for 21st century jobs, but actually thinking about what qualities a city needs in order to retain that human capital. So preparing for an urban future involves a lot more than just policymakers. Technology, real estate, the private sector, and investors are all key pieces of this equation, and they're all represented on the panel here today. Transportation, infrastructure, traffic management, waste management, healthcare delivery all depend on these industries. So we're fortunate today to have a panel of experts with vast experience in all of these areas, and we thank them for taking the time to be with us this morning. So today we want to have a discussion on, again, why and how this is a unique point in time for global cities, what policymakers can do to proactively create conditions for thriving urban populations, and how investors can both benefit from and aid in this process. So our discussion is going to focus mostly on urbanization within Europe, but we want to have a view toward what types of lessons can be learned here from the experience of our panelists that could potentially be exported to the developing world, as we're seeing so much rapid urbanization in that part of the world. We do plan to have time for Q&A later in the panel, so please save your questions until then. The bios for each of our speakers are actually contained in your program, so I'm not going to take a whole lot of time with that, but I'll just do, so you know who's on the stage, I'll do brief introductions. So Taimur Hayat is all the way to my right, is the Chief Strategy Officer of Primerica Investment Management, so he's representing the investor point of view today. Right next to me on my right is David Lutton, who is Executive Policy Director for London First. So he'll give us some perspective from both the public and private sectors. And then to my left is Mary Ricks, who is President and CEO of Kennedy Wilson Europe. So providing a bit of both a business kind of running CEO, but also from the real estate perspective, which is Kennedy Wilson's business. And then all the way to my left is Harry Van Doren-Malen, who's Chairman of IBM Europe. And I'm sure many people in the room are very familiar with IBM's leadership on smart cities and all of that work. So to jump right in, Taimur, I want to start with you. Take us through what you see as, you've talked to me before about the virtuous growth cycle for cities, and tell us a little bit about how that works and what you see as the opportunity for investors today.
Sure, and I think slide 4 is helpful to frame that as well. A lot of the debate in the urban growth, urbanization literature is around, does growth lead to urbanization? Does urbanization lead to growth? How do these pieces fit together? And certainly my approach, our approach is that the two really work together, and it's sort of less important to try and unravel the two and more to see what sustains that cycle. And there are three sort of starting points as you move from cottage industries to the factory floor and you need people in larger numbers. There are three things that make cities very attractive and help generate productivity and growth. One is certainly the fact that the labor market becomes denser, and as a result, you have more specialized folks to fill each position that you need to in a particular market. A second factor is you can get specialized companies. So you can get legal expertise in taxation, or you can get a company that makes a particular kind of processor for a chip. You couldn't do that in rural Kansas. You could do it if you have enough people and enough agglomeration of companies to get specialist companies who are therefore better doing what they do. And the third, and I think most powerful driver of growth is the fact that, and we should come back to this theme, humans innovate and learn through face-to-face interactions. And it's in cities that you really get that kind of innovation and idea sharing that drives productivity. Other companies then can see what's happening, can learn from that, and you get a virtuous cycle. That productivity then leads to higher wages, more skilled labor comes to the area, it increases the tax base. The tax base then allows the government to build more infrastructure, make the city more attractive. There's a whole range of policy measures that can help keep that virtuous cycle going. And that in turn attracts the next generation of companies and people to the area. Now that cycle can get interrupted. There are ways along each of that path that you can actually go in the reverse direction as well. But when it works, you truly get a successful city and a range of opportunities for investors and policymakers to participate in that growth.
Okay. So I think that actually sets a nice context, and probably a number of the panelists can jump in on this topic. But I'm interested in when you talk about what sort of goes awry with a city or along that virtuous growth cycle, why would a city step off that? Whether it's any of the three factors that you're mentioning or what else might be involved, and anyone can feel free to jump in on that. Maybe Harry, do you want to give us a perspective?
Yeah, sure. I think in my role as chairman, I visit a lot of cities in Europe, and I picked the example of Stockholm 12 years ago. Stockholm 12 years, the mayor, as a leader of a city, put some people together, he partnered up, and he set an ambition. I want my congestion fixed, the mobility in Stockholm. He applied measurement, and he involved the citizens. And he got it done. And he got re-elected, by the way, as well. So what I learned over time in all these cities who are more successful, they have a mayor who's really stepping up as a CEO, as a leader. They have a plan, not just a simple project. You say, look, that I'm fixing something, no, a program, if you will. They get partners around, they measure, and they involve citizens. And what I learned is that two big differentiators these days are technologies and the role of citizens. Citizens are the new army. So why don't you use them in your living labs structure, if you will? Yeah? And the final thing I would like to say, these powerful mayors, they separate the inhibitors. They said, listen, there's always a number of areas that are inhibiting progress. So rather than us all fixing the inhibitors, take it separate, make sure the army can progress, and with a few, fix the inhibitors. Yeah? So that's, in my experience, what I learned over here.
It's interesting on the point about the mayors, because we were just among the panel chatting about this before we started on, Michael Bloomberg from the US, the former mayor of New York City, has been very vocal about sort of exporting the model from New York City to other cities around the world, really. So I'm curious from, how exportable is a model, right? I mean, how much can really be prescribed? If you're saying, from one city there were certain factors that, strategically they were able to grow it and have economic prosperity. How do you bring that to another city? Can you speak about that, David, or can you?
I think yes and no. So I'm from London First, which is a business members organisation. Despite my accent, I'm going to talk to you about London. It's just a demonstration of the great diversity that is London. And urbanisation, I guess, is one of these things you quite often associate with emerging markets. But European capitals have similar challenges, and London in particular has some major ones which are based on population growth. So all European capitals are facing this situation where they've got weaker European growth, weaker economic growth relative to emerging markets, aging infrastructure, and reducing budgets. And you've got to work within that. London itself is creeping towards 10 million by 2036. That will put us into the mega city. We're growing at a faster rate than Victorian London. So I think now more than ever is the time to try and learn as much as possible from other countries. What the US has done really quite well, many US cities, They have, as you say, a high degree of autonomy, certainly fiscal autonomy to make long-term investments. But the other thing they've done, they've invested in economic development, a plan. So they've looked at where their economy is today and where it's going to be in the future, and looked at the growth sectors and actually asked the question, okay, so how can the public and the private sector build the enablers to support an economy as we move forward? So I think there's elements you can learn, but you can't just take one thing and drop it in.
And drop it in, right. And how are you seeing, I mean, the mayor of Chicago, I'm thinking of from the US again, has been very diplomatic, I suppose, in terms of building relationships with companies in China, because people, I think he's wisely seeing that there's this opportunity as companies are growing and looking, for foreign destinations, that you have to be competitive in that sense. I mean, are you seeing mayors that are sort of proactively doing that well within Europe to recruit businesses from outside, or can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, again, talking from the point of view of London, so London attracts more foreign subsidiaries than any other city in the world. So that's foreign subsidiaries with revenue of over $1 billion. So we're talking about substantial businesses, not just nameplates above the door. And we want to continue to be able to do that. So it means promoting London as much as possible across the globe. London has a combined promotional agency called London Partners, which goes out and attracts FDI and does tourism promotion. Compared to other cities, it's woefully underfunded. It has something like £12 million a year to try and promote London across the entire globe. Now, given the opportunities that are in China, etc., then that makes it very difficult. But it's something that the mayor can bring a lot of attention to, and a very high profile. Our Mayor Boris Johnson has done a lot of trips to China, etc.
Interesting, yeah. So, Mary, I want to turn to you. Why don't we look to the real estate market? Obviously, both residential and commercial real estate is an important piece of a city thinking through how attractive it's going to be for the population. So, can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of Europe and in the real estate market, and what Kennedy Wilson's doing?
Sure, and I might just ask you guys to turn to slide 10. So Kennedy Wilson, we're a public real estate vehicle listed on the London Stock Exchange. And one of our big focus has been housing and residential units, and to sort of help cities grow and deal with this population boom that we've all talked about. It's an asset class that we like quite a lot. And so we started here about 3 years ago and have been buying a lot of distressed assets from banks, and first started actually in Dublin and have done quite a lot in the UK. And so this project here that's up on the screen is a project that we bought from one of the UK banks, but it's a great example of, and this is just outside of Manchester, which has roughly 2.5 million people. This was a retail center with all the big services there, Marks & Spencer, Debenhams, Costa. And so everything's really there for residential and tenants to enjoy. And that's, I think, something that we're seeing is just residents moving out from the suburbs into city centers where there's services, there's restaurants, and just making, I think, life a bit easier to cope with. Because I think people are working so hard and very long hours that they want to be close to the center of town where things are happening. So they have to spend less time, sort of driving and getting to places. They can enjoy, making work-life balance a little bit better.
Do you look at, so when you're looking at a city and its ability to kind of build up rather than out, that's something that's going to be good for the health of the city, and do you look at things like that in terms of where you're making your investments?
If you go to slide 12, it's another kind of good example. And this is an example. This is in Dublin where we've invested. We have roughly 1,100 multifamily residential units. And this is a project that was an old gasometer building that was converted to a residential multifamily housing project that is literally 1 block from Google's headquarters. So it's right in the heart of Dublin. And this obviously was a repurposed building and that went up as opposed to the sprawl of going out. And I think part of what's important when we think about investing in cities is that there's good transportation, and that basically you've got the ability for people to live very close to where they work. And so building up in city centers is much more easy to do than building out.
Okay.
Densification is a big issue here, in housing is just one of the major issues for London, and it's the manifestation of urbanization for London. It's one of the key issues in terms of housing growth. Any of you that live here or have tried to buy a house here, it's incredible. Average house prices in the UK are 250,000. Average house prices in London are 450,000. It's a premier product. It's always been an expensive city, but the price of houses is just outstripping affordability, even for fairly senior people in well-paying positions. Now, I mean, we not been hitting our targets of building 32,000 houses since the 1970s. So by all accounts, we need to be building 55,000 every year. And Deloitte just did some work recently on business leaders and found out that housing was number 2 in terms of the potential disruption to London's competitiveness. And we did some work as well with Turner and Townsend and found out that of the 26, 39-year-olds, 70% said that they find the cost of their rent or mortgage unaffordable, and it may actually result in them moving out of London. So there's a kind of a risk of a reverse brain drain. Now, London is a city that's built on its intellectual capital, and if we can't house that talent, then it's a real problem going forward. Having said all of that, densification is very controversial. Something like planning for 200 towers in London, lots of people don't like them, but in reality, it's probably one of the only way forward. But London is a reasonably not that dense a city by European standards, certainly by American standards. So it could densify without actually fundamentally affecting. If you think about a lot of these 1960s, 1970s estates, a lot of them just have void space between them. So even low-rise could actually have more densification.
Yeah. I think this idea too that you raised, or Harry, did you want to jump in and comment?
Yeah, I'd like to make a remark on what I call the maturity model of cities, because a lot of time we talk about New York, we talk about London, but I like to bring in something else in the equation. That's what I call the maturity model. So in the European field, we have cities that are large, London, Berlin, Paris, what have you. We have middle cities and we have a lot of smaller cities. So a first differentiation is already that we have different in size. The second differentiation I see is that all these cities have different value propositions. The city like Bari in Italy, they have a value around fishing. The city of Stavanger in Norway, they have a value around oil. In Bornholm in Denmark, they have a value proposition on wind energy. So my point is that you can differentiate yourself through your size, but also through the value proposition you bring to the table. And those cities who build on the fact that they have something cooking there and expand it, it's better. I met with the mayor of Faro in the Algarve area in Portugal. And I said, what's your value proposition? What do you export? Hey, I have my beaches. I have my beaches, Oh, yeah. And the next thing, I have my beaches. And I said, hang on. Portugal is a small strip. They own 40 times the size in the sea. So did you ever think about creating energy from the sea with wave breakers? Did you ever think about digging for oil? Did you ever think about fishery? So that's what we need to do forward. So to me, it's a matter of size, the value proposition where you can build on, and thirdly, and that's a key element in cities, the speed you can bring to the table. So those mayors who can bring these knowledge institutions, these public people, the private people together and smash it into some speed, they make a difference. So I'm a fan of a maturity model in Europe, that you say based on these things, there are different stages, and that's how we need to build on forwards. Supported by Brussels, by the way, who provide a lot of money for these cities.
And I'd say the sort of economical housing for low and mid-skilled workers is a big theme even outside Europe. As you look at emerging markets, one of the big markers of what makes a successful city is really creating an opportunity for those workers to live in the city or near enough to the city, and not just building it for a small elite. And that's kind of one of the key markers we see in successful cities as well. So it's really a global phenomenon.
think the other thing that's important about scale, and just picking up on that point that you're making as well, is to a certain extent it depends on the historical relationship of the city and its capital to the rest of the country. So if you look at the UK, for example, if you look at around the world, all of the growth, the major growth, is in the cities of about 4 million plus, not even the mega cities of the 10 million plus. Now, the UK doesn't have any other cities of 4 million plus, right, individually. So London stands out as this enormous city and a huge part of the economy, in a way that if you look at Germany, for example, the economy is much more balanced across 3 or 4 major cities. Paris replicates that. So I think there is a question about agglomerations and scale, and cities actually cooperating together and thinking about themselves as a regional economic entity, as opposed to perhaps just a standalone Manchester. It's really what you want to think about is Manchester, Sheffield, Liverpool region, which actually does have the scale to compete on a global level.
Mm-hmm. And Timer, just the point you made on sort of the ability to provide that housing that the average person can live on. I mean, do you look at, can you talk a bit about the risks in terms of investing in cities that maybe don't have that, or how you would look at that from an investor perspective?
I mean, that links back a little bit to the risk theme that you mentioned earlier. I think along that virtuous cycle, there are lots of places you can fall off. Probably 2 or 3 of the sort of quantitative indicators that I look at is one, crime rates. The higher the crime rate is a leading indicator of what might happen to a city in terms of it being a place that attracts talent. The second is human capital levels. If you look at Detroit versus Austin in the US, even years before Detroit reached the sort of stagnation it has now, you could see that they just weren't attracting the kind of people who have university level educations and the skill set that would set them up for success. Mm-hmm. The third is just livability in terms of pollution levels and how friendly is a city for expats to come in, from talent from other parts of the country to come there. Mm-hmm. So cities that fail to provide that, and that's a combination of both the private sector and the government, are more likely to fall into that trap of not being able to reinvent themselves. Mm-hmm. And the fourth piece is what Harry mentioned around innovation, and there are pretty good data now in terms of which cities attract venture capital, which cities have universities that are getting top-notch talent, which cities are ones where you are getting more patents written and so on. Yeah. And those, again, are good indicators of cities that are going to be able to reinvent themselves. Those that aren't are very much at risk of areas where, whether it's an investor or a government, you create real risk of the city surviving and thriving.
Yeah. I want to pick up on that point about innovation, actually, because I think it's a really interesting one. And as an example, so the Milken Institute actually has, our Asia Center is headquartered in Singapore. So we know a lot about that city. I think it's an interesting example of a city that's often, or city-state, I guess, that's sort of held up as a beacon of all that's gone right in terms of the public sector at its best, right? I mean, they set out with a very specific goal. Within a very short amount of time, there's huge levels of economic prosperity. There's rising levels of wealth. It's a very livable city for any of you who've been there. At the same time, there's an element of life there, and I'm speaking as not someone that's lived there, that it doesn't quite have the grit and sort of that you have in a city like Hong Kong. And I think when you're looking at skilled and professional, highly educated workers, they want to live in a place that has arts and culture, that has that hum of innovation, that has alternative lifestyles, which you don't see so much in a city like Singapore. And I just wonder, is that a risk for a city like Singapore, especially as you see emerging cities in places like Malaysia and other parts of Asia? I'm looking at you, Harry, because I'm thinking you would have something to say. But
well, I mean, always Singapore indeed is the example where everything fits. You know, and then we can say, listen, it's small, so it's easier. It started a long time ago. The business is really driving it, investing. So it is what it is. But I think, I mean, it's their model. It's working. Fine, let it go. I mean, what I see more upon the European environment, why do cities like London or Amsterdam are so attractive to younger generations specifically? Yeah, because they don't like this, all cleaned up stuff, beautiful every regulation all over. They need riot, chaos a little bit to get going there. Not everything is so regulated. I mean, regulation is something I think from the past. In Brussels, regulation, rules. Well, innovation has something. Try something out. And that's why these youngsters specifically and you are young as well, of course, in the room here, are looking for these spaces where the environment is open, where it's innovative, where it's creative, where they can meet fellow people and together to create something. Listen, the growth of Europe is not coming from the larger companies, it's coming from the SMEs, small groups. That they are driving the creativity, innovation and growth. So, create that atmosphere, that's what I see happening here. Yeah.
But
my parents, by the way, they loved Benidorm in Spain. That was the anchor of the world, Benidorm. Why? Spain, Singapore, whatever. But I see youngsters, Generation D, as we call them today, Generation Data, are going for these cities.
Right. But interestingly, I mean, we're seeing it's not just young people flocking into cities, right? So if the Institute actually just did a study on the best performing cities for successful aging and ranked an index in the US actually, and found New York City and Washington, D.C. and Boston, I think I'm probably misquoting, but were among the top 10. And that was sort of one of the key highlights from that study. It was surprising that aging populations are actually moving more into cities. And so, Mary, I guess maybe you could comment on that. I'm wondering if you're seeing that in terms of the type of housing you have to have available. I mean, that there's sort of this meshing of generations. And what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's true. We own 19,000 apartment units across all the markets we work in, which is Japan, Europe, and then the west coast of the United States. And we've seen that everywhere. Like in Tokyo, we've seen people moving into city centers. We now have 50 apartment buildings right in the heart of Tokyo. And obviously that's an aging population in Japan, and that's an issue that they have. But I think people just want to make their lives a little bit easier. There's more culture, there's more restaurants, there's, it's a more energy, more buzz, like you were saying. There's, people want to be creative and be around people that they like to learn from, and I think we're seeing that everywhere. So where we're looking to invest, it's all about the scarcity of land. And so we like the fact that whether it's London or whether it's Los Angeles or whether it's Tokyo, there's not a lot of land to be developed. And we like the fact that there are a well-educated population, and that there's cultural services, there's restaurants, the livability scores are very high. So wherever we're looking to invest, those are key factors. And I think city living is the way forward that we're going to see all across Europe for sure.
I think at the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot to learn from cities like London, some of the sort of new inner cities that are more livable and have that kind of lifestyle choice for new cities, which again is a little more of an Asian phenomena than it is in Europe. But the Indian government, for example, has said 200 new cities in India. And there's a big debate going on how should the cities be built? Should they be built on grids? Do you kind of create the park space and the multifamily living spaces that we are now kind of reinventing as we regenerate urban centers in Manchester or Austin or elsewhere?
Right.
And I think that's another sort of interesting angle in terms of how do those cities develop, which ones will be successful. The Chinese government, to some extent, has taken a venture capital approach where you see one success like Shenzhen and you see 9 failures where you haven't attracted a population. What makes Shenzhen different from the other cities? Is 1 out of 10 a good rate of success for new cities? I think that's for a venture capitalist, that might be a success rate. And how do you sort of see new city formation from that lens is interesting. And how many lessons from Europe can you take to a Malaysia, to China, to India?
Yeah, I think that's a point of competitive advantage, certainly for Europe, as many of its cities are centuries old as cultural capitals. So again, talking to London specifically, it's a culture capital for both high and low culture. It's an open, liberal environment, so therefore it attracts a lot of young people to come and work here. It's very, very difficult to replicate that kind of, it's difficult to put your finger on it and understand what it is, but that kind of buzz. And you can build all the most fantastic opera houses, but you still need someone to write the opera and push the limits and do new things. So I think that's an area that Europe definitely has an advantage of for a while yet.
Yeah, and I suppose, Timer, you touched on, which is different for Europe than it is in Asia, but this idea of, revitalizing and repurposing an old city like a city in Europe versus, the cities in these emerging markets where it's really sort of building up. are there lessons you think, and I mean anyone can jump in on this, but that you would apply from from the developed world to the developing, or or do you think about that in terms of an investment portfolio, like what's more risky, or how you see that laying out?
I mean, certainly in the developed world, both in Europe and the US, we see both infrastructure and real estate opportunities in that revitalization of city centers and so on. So whether it's, there's a vast amount of aging infrastructure in the US, for example, that needs to be replaced. It's true that a lot of it is done by government, and it's hard as an individual investor to participate. But public-private partnerships are growing in the infrastructure space. There was one in New Jersey where we are headquartered recently. So we do see that as a big opportunity, because there is a crumbling infrastructure that needs to be replaced. There's clearly a funding shortfall that municipal bonds in the US or government funding alone can't fill. I think, as Mary was saying, there's, I think, a huge opportunity in real estate in terms of taking these city centers and creating multi-purpose living, creating opportunities for younger people and certainly for older people as they return to cities, to your point. Not in terms of sort of separate, but senior living communities that are being created in urban centers again. So we see all those as opportunities. Some of them are translatable to the emerging markets. I'd say there are probably different opportunities there that we see as even bigger ones. We talked a little bit about affordable housing and accommodation for low-skilled workers. I'd say another one is, it's very difficult to invest directly in infrastructure in developing countries. Modi's announced a new state in India that will have a new capital. There'll be new roads built, new railway lines that connect these cities. Very hard to invest in them because they're entirely government-owned or just the private investor climate isn't right yet.
Right.
But we think you can invest through real estate as an indirect way to play in those infrastructure opportunities. So along these corridors will be new houses, new apartments, new real estate opportunities that you can capture. So I think it's slightly different.
So maybe to add a few comments here. I mean, sometimes we always look to the eastern part of the world as the Holy Land. Everything is possible, everything is beautiful. Listen, my experience is, of course, they are growing, but at a certain moment in time, they also need to invest in their infrastructure. You cannot grow forever, otherwise you get out of balance. So what I think what European cities can do is that they say, listen, what is it that we can export? Which solutions can we export, even make money with it and help? And I give you a few examples. First, energy. A big problem in Europe, we are using more and we have less, if you will. So we are having a lot of situations in Europe where we're working with energy grids, that we use energy from different angles, from your house, from your car, whatever, reuse it many, many times. So we have that solution. As an example, the island of Malta made it. Why? Malta spends 70% of the budget only to import energy. So they have this grid, so they are able to expand that grid now to larger environments, Second thing, this phenomena of data privacy and security, two big attacks on our world. We are working on it in Europe, how to deal with it, how to attack it, and how to help it. Those are things that we can help that part of the world as well. So my point is that, compare both areas of the world, see where we can help, and see where we can make business and sell and export and grow and create jobs, etc. Look to it from that angle as well. I think that is very relevant. Yeah.
I mean, just to echo that, another example would be wired cities, and the fact that you do have cities that are, particularly in Europe, very well connected, obviously Japan too. Yeah. Investments and opportunities in broadband and cell towers, that entire wiring infrastructure will be a huge part of the opportunity as more cities become mega cities as they grow. Yeah. And again, there's a lot to learn there from European examples.
Traffic in Kuala Lumpur, have you been there? Hey. Takes some hours.
I was in Hanoi 3 weeks ago.
There you go.
I can tell you, anyone that you have to cross the street there, yeah, it's very tough.
Yeah,
Did you want to comment?
Yeah, for London, I think there's a lot to learn from looking around the world, seeing how infrastructure is funded. This population
now is private funding for the toll roads.
Exactly.
And, yeah.
I mean, the infrastructure gap for London is going to be enormous as we move up in terms of population. Now, the Mayor and City Hall have just put together this infrastructure plan 2050 that looks all the way out to 2050, and it's suggesting a total investment over £1 trillion. Now, London's problem is not its ability to plan and deliver on that, but it's actually the ability to fund it. because the funding system in the UK is based on grants from the Central Treasury, which fund the mayor's or the City Hall's projects, which quite often can be ring-fenced and have to be negotiated over a 12-month period. Now, that's not really a way to fund an international city. So we always are looking at ways that we can share the load with the public sector, the users, the uplift from the developers along the areas that are invested, etc. So there's definitely a lot to be learned.
Are people raising their hands on in the private sector to do that? Is it tough to convince them?
It's tough to convince them because the constitutional settlement is not there. I mean, the zeitgeist at the moment is we talk about devolution, obviously driven a lot by the independence debate in Scotland, put on the table devolution again for both London, the Mayor of London is a form of devolution, and for the city regions. But if you look at it in context, the Mayor of London is responsible for something like 7% of the tax that's collected in London. Compare that to the Mayor of New York, it's near 50%. So, you know, we're really a statistical outliner in that respect. So unfortunately, to make it really attractive, it's going to require more change and more kind of fiscal autonomy for London to give more certainty of investment for investors.
There's also a side remark on this one as well. Take the city of Istanbul as an example. It's packed, there's no space anymore, there's no money anymore. So what they're doing as an example with project, with Vodafone, whatever, that at the moment people are driving their cars, they can activate their phone and they act like a cell. And they get more data and they use that information to impact traffic. You know, that's a solution that you can do.
Yeah.
Second thing, in our business, these days, guys, we always talk about cloud computing. Yeah, cloud computing. You don't have your stuff in your own premises anymore, but you have it in the cloud. Great. You know, that's a cost carrier, a cost driver, and it's great. What was Europe doing? I mean, it's a great idea, but I still like my Munich cloud, and I like my German cloud, and my London cloud, and my Wimbledon cloud, whatever. So where we have opportunities, you know, I mean, for scalability, if you will, for cost reduction, we use or sometimes misuse data privacy, and I want to do it on my own, and we have 28 European countries here not to do it. Well, keep going there, guys. You know, after a while, it's not maintainable anymore, so we need to go that way.
But that's fundamentally the issue in Europe, isn't it? We have this enormous market, but we don't have an integrated digital market and services in the way that the US does, or an enormous Chinese market.
Europe can be the biggest and most important geography of the world if only we become this single market. That's it.
That's it.
What would you say,
small detail,
in terms of policymakers that are focused on that here as a priority? Is that?
Well, that's a vulnerability. And certainly for London. I mean, London does not benefit from an enormous domestic market in the way that Hong Kong or New York does. Europe is effectively London's domestic market, so most of the business that's done here in London is servicing, you know, international and European market. It's a problem, the kind of uncertainty that's created around Britain's long-term membership of Europe. We certainly hear that from a London perspective. It's one of the big uncertainties around our competitiveness, and we hear about big corporations that are hedging their bets in Ireland, for example, because, you know, certainly in financial services they would need to maintain their passporting across Europe. And that's not good for London's competitiveness. We want to say we're the kind of world's headquarters, and if there's uncertainty over access to the world's largest market, then the two things just don't compute.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I was going to say is, in terms of helping build infrastructure, that's something that we as a developer of housing have to do. So, for example, we're doing a joint venture with a governmental agency in Dublin, and we're going to be building residential as well as office, and there's a bridge that needs to be built across to connect the city. And that's something that's getting pushed over to us as a developer. So that's, I think that's one way that private and public can work together. So by doing joint ventures and by having the developer who's going to be doing something for profit, you know, share in the cost of the infrastructure. And that's something that we're seeing in everything that we're doing on a new development scale.
Are there qualities about that type of investment that the public sector could do to make it more attractive to a developer like you?
I think it's just all about whatever economic terms, whether it's doing something, you know, pushing it out further and making it sort of more palatable as an investment, because obviously nothing's going to be developed unless you have debt capital, unless there's liquidity in the market, unless there's an economic benefit to a private or public developer. So I think it's just really about coming together with the public and the private to do joint ventures to help grow cities. And we're engaged in that in all of our markets right now.
I mean, a great example where we are headquartered in Newark, New Jersey. Newark was once a major industrial city in the U.S. Certainly one that has lots of areas of decline right now. There was a park right in the middle of the city called Military Park that was in complete decay. Drug addicts, generally not in great shape as a safe area to go. And we took the Bryant Park model, which is another park in New York City, and got all the buildings around that, which are owned by private real estate property developers and so on, and said for every dollar you invest in reinvigorating the park, adding a burger joint at the center, rebuilding the park premises, there'll be a multiple gain in terms of what the property values will be around that and the leasing values of people who might move there.
Right.
And they put the money in. So it was ultimately a private-private partnership to some extent, but it was very effective. There are chairs there that are not actually bolted on, and only 2 have been stolen in the last 9 months.
Well, that's a good indicator.
Very rare for work. Yeah, it's a
So
sign.
there's one other theme I want to try to weave in here, and Harry, I think I'm going to go to you on this because we're talking a lot about investments in infrastructure, and David, you may want to comment on this too, which is obviously a key piece of making a city livable. But it seems to me, in terms of the public sector, there are, what about the role of taking care of citizens, right? Investing in public health and education, and how critical is that? And can you talk a little bit about that piece?
Listen, of course, the role of the public environment is still important because they, in the end, take care of the citizens, period. That's their accountability, if you will. But where in the past the public had the power, had the money, had the skills, had the authority, I think we are now in a situation that the public still has the authority. They don't have the money anymore, they hardly have the skills sometimes, so they need to work together with the public, the private sector and the knowledge institute, university, etc. to get it going, if you will. That's a new shift. So that can work, but people need to respect that model, if you will. So I'll give you one example on this famous phenomenon as healthy aging, if you will.
Right.
So, I mean, the government can secure healthy aging, but in doing that, they need to work with private sector. And we have great examples in Europe. Bolzano is a great example, Stavanger is a great example, Groningen is a great example. And here's how it works. Where in the past, healthy aging was advice to you guys, stop smoking, stop drinking, start jogging, whatever, that was the advice. Now in the new world, and we have these examples, 150,000 citizens are connected to a system which they voluntarily support, which they do, etc. And because we do that, and because we analyze this data, we now can say, for you, you can keep drinking. Because in your DNA, it's irrelevant.
Right.
You personalize, whatever. And then the government in that area say, hey, I've done it. You can be the hero, you'll be fine. But the rest is working on it. And most importantly, SMEs are connecting to this, so they create jobs. Hey, that's the model. So it is a kind of ego model, whatever, it's the same outcome, but the roles are changing. And if you find a way in an area which they normally call a city, because forget it, in Brussels we will not get it there, nationally we will not get it, but the city is an area where it's still doable, people know each other, etc. And if you can get this going, hey, then you flow.
Was it Amsterdam, the hospital I heard you talking about this year, where you can actually put your fingerprint in and it maps your DNA to diagnose you and tells you
certain part in Holland they do it.
Yeah.
This is your unique DNA. So what they say, listen, you're sick, and by the way, 20% of the people are sick, and by the way, for 60% this medicine is giving 100% hit rate, whatever.
Yeah.
And then people normally say, dream on, Jules Verne, whatever. Hey guys, it's there. Now we need simply to say, adapt it, fix the data privacy and the security items. By the way, there's more than a detail. I mean, we need to feel people must feel trusted, but these are things that are possible.
Right.
And I don't have to dwell again to older and younger generation, but normally at 40 years of age, above they say, whoa, this is scary. And below 40, they say, hey, sounds interesting. Let's explore it.
Mm-hmm. David, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of do more with less is kind of the mantra, I guess. I mean, public health is is delivered centrally. So it's not something that the city government has any control over. I mean, so if you maybe look at education, be a better example for London. I mean, London's inner city education 20 years ago, 15 years ago was woeful, and it has improved incredibly and dramatically, and with some of the inner city schools deliver some of the best results in the country. One of the things that we're interested in, and the City Hall's also interested in as well, is the employability skills. So it's kind of soft skills beyond education, because one of the great things about London is its people and its talent. It's a place where people want to be and people want to come. That's good, but also it creates an incredibly competitive job market for certainly lower skilled workers. And sometimes what we're finding is the skills, the employability skills, the soft skills, what's expected of you, etc., as an employer, connecting the skills to workplaces is just not there. And someone perhaps needs to take a strategic view on that for London. So yeah, really important in terms of maintaining the quality of life.
Are there companies, I don't know, Mary, if this is something you think about as a CEO, but are there companies that are doing that particularly well?
Lots of companies are doing it really well. So the banks have great programs. The professional services sector have fantastic programs. The problem is they all tend to be a little bit siloed, and they don't cut right across. So I think that's what's needed, is looking at it as a kind of strategic, holistic issue and not just sectorally.
Right, as a system. We did say we'd have time for Q&A, so there are, I think, microphones in the back. So if anyone has a question, if you could, yeah, we have a question right here. If you could just identify yourself and say where you're from and
Maria Athena Papathanasiou. I'm an environmental lawyer and private investor. One thing that maybe I missed, but I haven't seen much of a focus on, is the issue of pollution in cities. I've been a resident of London for more than 20 years, having come to study here and stayed ever since. And I have seen so much rising pollution in a city like London that a lot of people are thinking of moving out just because of the health hazards that pollution creates. I mean, other cities in Europe are equally bad, but London, because of its size and its importance, I mean, it is on the forefront. I know the Mayor of London has been doing a lot to combat that, but I think the scale of the problem is such that it's getting worse by the minute. Because I'm an environmentalist and I'm a scientist as well as a lawyer, I have done extensive research into the breathing problems, which I'm not going to go into about now. But I don't see in panels or in conferences, everybody talks about the fantastic economic benefits, about the multiculturalism and all that. I'm not saying all these things are not important, but how come that all you young people are missing the most important element, which is actually one's health? The London property prices might skyrocket even more, but if people are starting dying from respiratory diseases and all sorts of related cancers that this city pollution creates, I wonder what will matter about the rising prices and the multicultural buzz.
Okay. Go for it.
It's a good point. I'm going to have to say, no, it's a good point. I mean, hopefully public transportation is helpful with that.
I mean, is that in London is like I think it is a good point. I think of cities in Asia probably before a city like London. Is that something?
It's a great point. And
yeah.
You obviously know more about it than I do. I mean, there are, you know, as you say, there is requirements on the mayor to have environmental policies, etc. that have to be consulted upon. But what's really interesting for us, it's a bit like housing. We were doing this economic development plan with the mayor's office, and because of that, we had to consult some like 400 different companies around the city, mainly large companies, to be fair, but lots of companies across the city. And the thing that came up quite a lot was quality of life and air quality, mainly, with housing as well. So as business members organisation, it's interesting. It's like housing kind of crept up, and definitely environmentalism is kind of becoming more to the fore. But yeah, it's a fair point.
Any other questions? Gentleman in the front.
Thank you very much. Rob Gardner. I'm co-CEO of Reddington. We advise pension funds on where to invest their money and make sure people still have money when they retire. Actually, question for David and for Harry. I think the stuff IBM is doing around smarter cities is fantastic. What are the barriers to entry of applying the sort of data, technology, smart metering to cities? We heard some examples, but why aren't we doing more of this?
I can take that first. One of the things certainly that I hear is, again, it's just the complexity of cooperation across boroughs. So it's 33 boroughs make up the GLA. And so although there's a willingness there, there's a complexity of sharing all the different data. They collect it in different ways. So it's a matter of working together much better. I mean, I don't know that much about like how Smart Cities programme is actually being implicated. And then the other thing is, again, that we hear a lot is on digital infrastructure itself. So it seems to be a tale of two cities on digital infrastructure. If you are a large corporate and you can invest in your own kit, as it were, then on the wholesale side of the market, we're absolutely up there, world class. But as you come down towards SME and certainly on the retail side of the market, there seems to be an issue there somewhere along the lines. I think it's a mixture of not good cooperation and something about the infrastructure itself.
Harry, do you want to comment on that? And then we have another question.
I think on data, I only like to use the word education. I've been to Brussels, to Strasbourg, to talk about data. And now I understand why they are so hot on protection. Because they see data as one big pile. And I give you one education piece. There's private data, should be untouched, no question about it. But there's industrial data, a car talking to a fridge or talking to another car, whatever. That is something we knew. Free flow of data to have all these benefits, if you will. So I learn over time and time. A lot of people don't know what they're talking about. Therefore, protect, holding progression, if you will. Really, that's my key point. You know, don't know. And we as an industry need to do a much better job. Because other people say, no, it's trusted, secure, do better. And while I'm talking 10 seconds, I mean, on your pollution remark, I think that the majority of the work we are doing on energy and on mobility are huge drivers to restore pollution, you know? I'm not going to convince you in this 30 seconds, but I'd like to see you in the break, please.
Who had the next question? Is there right here?
Hi there, my name's Conrad, I'm also from Readington. I was wondering if you had any comments about a recent trends we're seeing on the continent, certainly, where cities are seeking more and more input from the voters in terms of what projects to develop. There was a recent case in Paris where they listed all the various projects that people could actually do, and it was actually the people who voted who chose. So the question really is to what extent will cities in the future be shaped by urban planners and people who actually know what they're doing, and how much will be just by democratic choice, and how many more people there will be in any given area?
Yeah. Well, a few points on this one. I mean, we always talk about public and private. I think that's a little bit old-fashioned. It's private, public, and people. I'm a big fan of living labs. Ask the people to join. They have a vested interest. I have a vested interest in my own health. I have a vested interest in the pollution in the city where I live. And I like to contribute. But please tell me how. And if I'm an extra army. So I support these drives, you know?
David, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's getting that right level of localism, isn't it, versus centralism. And I've just mentioned the complexity of the boroughs alone. Then you've got the GLA on top of that. Then you've got Transport for London. You've got the Mayor's Office. You've got the London Assembly. So we have all these different layers. And if you take a case like, you know, air capacity, which is a big issue for London. So in its whole history, it's been this transport hub as well as a capital hub and a hub for people. And we need to invest in more capacity if we want to make sure we've got connections to emerging markets going forward. And, you know, it's taken us since the war to build another runway in the UK. So imagine putting that to the populace to see where that would be. I'm not sure if we would get any further forward either. So yeah, it's about striking the right level, and I don't know if we've got it quite right yet.
Was there another question? Yep.
Hi, thank you for a great panel. My name is Sandra and I work at CAF Venturesome. I manage an affordable housing fund there. And I just have a question about kind of the impact of urbanization on affordable housing. And I know, David, you touched on a lot of this earlier. And I guess if what we are seeing a lot of is that a lot of individuals on low to mid incomes are being priced out of the housing market, in London in particular, and across the UK as well. So I was just wondering if the panel can speak to any models that they have seen in addressing this issue, in particular, the demand for affordable housing. And we think that it's really, housing is really crucial to creating sustainable cities and robust cities that can allow people from kind of all demographic levels to remain in their community. So I was just wondering if there are any models that you have seen.
Do you want to comment
that
on
address
that,
this?
Mary,
Either
No, I mean, I would say
public or business.
from our perspective, anything that we're developing, whether it's a redevelopment or a brand new development, there's going to be an element of affordable housing, as there should be. And I think what we're seeing the governmental agencies go to is actually having the housing on site. So as opposed to paying an in lieu fee, actually having housing available for people to live in. Because I think that the past model was very much about the developer can pay the money, and then that money will be spent on affordable housing somewhere outside of the development that you're doing. So I think it's important to actually build housing for different socioeconomic levels. So that's what we're seeing, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
Did you want to comment?
The only thing I'd say about affordable housing is affordable housing absolutely incredibly important. As you say, you see that all the time. There's actual requirements on developers to put in affordable housing. But I think it's only one part of the housing problem. The real problem is supply. If you had more houses built and more supply, that would resolve some of the economics around the pricing. Mm-hmm. So actually, one of the things that we're interested in, again, you're talking about which is the right level of localism, is we have a Transport for London, which is an integrated agency to deal with London's transport network, and maybe we should be thinking about an integrated agency to look at London's housing as, again, a strategic problem. So that might be something that we can look at.
And just to take beyond Europe, I think particularly with newer cities or cities that are far from being mega cities yet, I think city charters are another way that people are trying to refocus on this. So there is, I think, a planning intervention, given that that affordable housing is kind of going to be key to the city's long-term success, and not just housing for the most highly skilled population. Kind of building that into the planning mandate of the city is, I think, one thing most people are seeing, learning from the experience of cities like London, where it's such a big issue.
Right.
And we have seen actually a lot of planners agree to commercial to resi reuse. Yeah. So we've seen that be quite relaxed. Mm-hmm. And so in a lot of pools of assets that we're buying, when we're coming up with commercial assets, whether it be in Covent Garden shops above, or space above, like the Speedo shop that we own, we're looking at converting that to resi as opposed to office. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing the planners.
I think there's that, and then also the other thing is so much land in London is actually public sector owned still as well. Mm-hmm. So we need an absolute kind of doomsday book of where is the public sector land that's owned. The NHS trusts own vast swathes as well, and actually get that available for housing.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. We may have to leave it at that, is there one more question? Did you want to? Yep, you can have the last word.
Why don't do a closing comment? Eh? And so I've written down, lower the center of gravity. I like that word, because I really fundamentally believe that municipalities, urban regions are the area where still a lot of power is, if you will. And the three final comments I'd like to leave you with, I mean, we are really entering, let's face reality, in a world of teaming and sharing. Teaming and sharing. The world of closed, protect, it's me, I own it, whatever, is more or less gone. So we need to realize that. Secondly, I mean, we always talk about face-to-face buildings. Hey, social media, internet, I mean, connections, how people find each other. It's a huge difference. It's happening at the moment. And the third thing I like to say, we really need all the talent we have in this world to tackle the real societal issues we have. You know, if you look to energy, healthcare, now with Ebola again, you know, mobility, education in the world. I mean, there are so many things we can do. So we better organize our talent around these things, you know, and that's the real issue. Yeah. So we as leaders need to step up big time, in my view.
I think on the last point, just one thing which is separate from cities is, as cities urbanize and urban growth happens, you will have 1 billion less people in rural parts of the world.
Yeah.
And particularly in Asia, that means the way small-scale, low capital-intensive farming is done, it will no longer work.
Right.
So there's probably a whole separate series of implications that we haven't explored here, and it's not about cities, but is hugely important to the Milken Institute's agenda around capital-intensive farming. Is the American agricultural model the right one, or is it not?
Feeding the world. Yeah.
What are the new corridors of food around the world as things change with this much more urban population?
Yeah, we'll have to leave that for the global conference, I guess. I do think that the point about technology, though, sort of was striking me listening to this conversation, that as technology has enabled us to be more and more connected, right, virtually, that, you know, proximity in terms of your work, it matters less and less theoretically, but yet people still keep pouring into cities. And, you know, just there's something about that sort of being in the mix, and that obviously is just irreplaceable to a certain extent. So, so thank you, all of you, for joining us on the panel, and thank you for coming. And we're moving on to lunch.